Anyways, first I wanted to get into some updates on the war in Ukraine. And basically, I want to split the rest of this podcast into two segments. First off, it looks like Russia is both surrounding Bakhmut, which is a mining town in Ukraine, but it's also running out of weapons and could see issues. So that's kind of fascinating to me. And then second, I want to talk about the Wagner Group's influence in Bakhmut, and then talk about why I think there could be actually some serious issues with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the head of the Wagner Group and is a Russian oligarch who I think could challenge Putin. I talked about him a little bit. He's been an influential figure in kind of this shadow side of the Russian economy involving misinformation, propaganda, and also running a mercenary group. But anyways, The Economist has an article from today that discusses how even though the intense fighting in Bakhmut is continuing, it's not looking as good for the Russian military as some thought. NBC News reports here, in quotes, over the weekend, Russian troops continued to advance through brutal close quarters fighting around the city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, despite a lack of ammunition hindering their progress. The article continues, in quotes, noting that Bakhmut is currently surrounded on three sides after months of bombardment that has laid much of the mining city to waste. The defensive stand has become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance to Russia's invasion. The article also writes, Bakhmut holds is a rallying cry heard around the country, and President Volodymyr Zelensky's nightly videos address the nation talking about this. The article also writes, Ukrainian positions in the east have been worn down by an intensified Russian assault that has seen a mix of ex-convict Wagner fighters and newly mobilized military reservists who've been thrown into waves of attacks. I think the whole phenomenon, too, of the Wagner Group using ex-convicts is very fascinating. Troubling because you wonder what happens once this conflict slows down. But we're not going to be able to speculate and address that in today's episode. But the Wagner Group has really filled holes in the Russian defense failures. And we'll get into more of that later, but I think it's kind of fascinating when you look at how effective the Wagner Group has been. And they've even become somewhat of a propaganda movement in Russia as well. I should also note, though, that the British Ministry of Defense has said Saturday, in quotes, in late February, Russian reservists were ordered to attack a Ukrainian position with firearms and shovels. It continues, the shovels are likely the same ones used to dig trenches, which had been used on the front line by Russian forces since the days of the Tsars. And I don't totally understand it, but apparently the use of the shovel is some kind of pride on the battlefield thing that's been around during other Russian conflicts throughout the last 100 or 200 years. But this just sounds brutally violent, sounds atrocious. I can't even imagine what it's like on the ground. But whenever you read a headline talking about shovels are being used in the trenches to fight, they dig the trenches with these shovels and then they're killing people with these shovels. I mean, it's just sounds like a nightmare. And I've seen photos of the area, and it is looking more like color version photos of like a World War I trench warfare system than anything modern. And I was talking with a friend about this in the car a few months ago, and I think he kind of brought this up then, and it's all starting to really click now. Like, he was talking about how, these conflicts in the early days start out with modern technology, precision attacks, but once these forms of weapons are depleted, these conflicts really do decline, and they go back to the primordial nature of just kind of trench warfare, violent, brutish force. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in places like Bakhmut. And I should also note that the Wagner Group, which I have talked about extensively, is really running the table here. And it's kind of interesting to see what this will do, I guess, for Prigozhin's propaganda as head of the Wagner Group. But anyways, moving on, I have seen that Ukrainian military leaders just don't want to withdraw from the city because this is that symbol of resistance. And the American side, at least, is kind of downplaying the importance of Russia taking this and also wondering if Russia can even take this. And they say if they do, it's really not a big deal. And what I mean here is that Lloyd Austin, America's defense secretary, said in an Economist article that a potential Ukrainian withdrawal could be a mere repositioning and not a setback. Could be good news. Again, good news doesn't really come to mind when you look into what's really happening on the ground. But to go even further, where there are signs of some sort of tension happening here, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, has warned that a lack of ammunition could lead to a collapse of Russia's front line. Obviously, when you're using shovels, that definitely comes to mind. And he added on Telegraph over the weekend, in quotes, "The situation will not be sweet for all military formations protecting Russian interests." And he separately wrote, in quotes here, ammunition that had been promised by Moscow in February had not arrived. He added that he wasn't sure whether this delay was caused by ordinary bureaucracy or a betrayal. And to me, these comments are actually kind of fascinating and maybe can give us a glimpse into the internal breakdowns in the Kremlin or the military failures. When he says it's either being caused by ordinary bureaucracy or a betrayal, I would probably say it's the bureaucratic breakdown. The Kremlin, I don't think, was completely prepared for what's been happening in Ukraine. I don't know if it's a betrayal, but these words that Prigozhin are using, calling this a betrayal, really show that we are seeing a divide inside of Russia and maybe growing criticism of Putin's approach to the war in Ukraine. And now, just remember, when I say there's criticism of Putin's approach to the war in Ukraine, it's less people criticizing him for the invasion and saying we need to get out of here and leave Ukraine alone. It's more people saying he's not doing enough. And Prigozhin is definitely on that side saying Putin is not doing enough here. And if I was in power, we would have a much more hard-handed approach to what we're doing here. And I think this is more just how inept the Russian military is at getting arms to its front lines. But either way, one could argue that things are not looking good on the front lines. Even though this giant offensive has started, there's a lot of bloodshed, a lot of loss, and resources are getting low. Again, that's why I think China's peace plan or appeasement plan, whatever you want to call it, wouldn't be bad for Russia so they could have time to restock and replenish. Now, I actually want to talk about Prigozhin in a moment here, more in detail, and kind of why these dynamics are fascinating to me. But before we move on, I should also note that warfare and logistics aside, Bakhmut has been described as just an utter hellscape. And just sounds like a truly depressing and tragic matter there. The Economist notes here in quotes, "Previously a mining community of around 80,000 people, Bakhmut now has only a few thousand civilians remaining in it and its surrounding towns, mostly elderly and those unwilling or unable to leave. And the city, according to drone footage, is just completely leveled. Many of the streets are just dust. And the troubling thing here to me is that a lot of these cities are really starting to look like exactly what happened in places like Syria over the last decade, Chechnya before then. They're pretty much doing the same thing. They're not trying to save anything, trying to make any agreements or discussions here. It's all about just kind of an absolute destruction. And it's really not very heartwarming to see.